From 1710 until 1963, St. Paul's Cathedral was the tallest building in London. Its dome tops out at 365 feet. The building is 518 feet long, 121 feet wide, and 246 feet wide at the cross. Its organ has 7,250 pipes, 5 manuals, and 137 stops. The largest bell in its tower weighs 3,130 kilograms. Winston Churchill's funeral was there. Princess Diana and Charles were married there at St. Paul's. Sandra and I were there one Sunday when a retired clergy was joining the staff. And she had to kneel and pledge absolute loyalty to the dean of the cathedral and to the bishop. And interestingly, she had to promise not to change anything. I'm sure our Vam would be glad to do that. When Pilate confronts Jesus about his supposed kingship, Pilate has this kind of royalty in mind. Someone with a large palace, with their own cathedral, a huge army to protect them, a large retinue of followers and of staff, and of course, one big ring to kiss. And in so many ways, the church, the Christian church, has bought into Pilate's model of kingship over the one that Jesus lived. The royal church, with its cathedral and its elaborate decorations and its priests in beautifully stitched robes, which were meant to proclaim the greatness and the glory of God, the majesty of God, left behind far too often the Jesus whose kingdom is not of this world. In other words, not like this world, not like the king who Pilate imagined. In his commentary on this text, Professor Bill Loader notes well that Jesus subverts the image of kingship, which is at the very heart of our faith and of our Christian community and at the heart of God. Loader says we've forgotten that kingship is a broken metaphor. Jesus broke it. Jesus took it and threw it down on the tile floor at Pilate's palace. And somehow we forget. We forget that he shattered that image of the king, the royal king, the royal church, because royalty has always been easier to embrace. I was pondering not wearing my gown today and the stoles, what I thought were, signs of royalty. But I discovered that this gown, which is traditionally called a Wesley gown, after John Wesley, founder of Methodism, was actually Wesley's sleeping gown. He slept in this thing. Somehow I've never tried it, and I'm not sure how Sandra would be open to that idea. But somewhere along the line of history and of practice, it became Wesley's preaching gown. So when you think of it, I'm dressed in an 18th century pajamas this morning. Methodism tried to break the mold of the royal church. Wesley preached, if you remember, in fields. He advocated for minors and for prisoners, to stop child labor, to end slavery, and more. And when Wesley read this morning's text, he knew that Jesus had broken the metaphor of what it was to be a king. What kind of struck me this week in looking at all the paintings over the centuries of this scene of Pilate and Jesus meeting was how they always cast Pilate and Jesus as seeming equals. Jesus was usually in the pictures bound by his hands at the back. And sometimes Pilate was seated on a seat as if it was a throne. But they looked similar in stature, in presentation, in wellness, as if, you just brought two equals together for a meeting on Zoom. And artists like bishops could not imagine, I think, for even half a second that we would be the lesser party, that Jesus should be shorter and less well-dressed and lower than the Roman power. But it goes to the heart, it seems to me, of our attempt over the centuries to find a place at the table. We wanted equality and power with the kings of the state. And we believed that a royal church with power over others was going to find us a way to be at that table. Alternatively, what would have happened if we'd shown up in our pajamas like Wesley and preached in the fields and not the cathedrals? What if we'd collectively decided that kingship was a broken metaphor and that being a servant church, a serving church, was our true identity in the world? What kind of different path would we have followed if royalty had not been our default position? Professor Dolores Williams of Union Seminary in New York, she grew up in the southern U.S., and she remembers Sunday mornings when the minister would call out, "Who is Jesus?" And the choir would yell back in a loud and strong voice, "King of Kings and Lord Almighty." And then little Miss Huff, maybe in the back row, would call out in this soft and fragile voice, "Poor little Mary's boy, poor little Mary's boy." And then it would go back and forth again, "Who is Jesus?" And on it would go. Which is why I chose, as you'll hear later, the final hymn this morning, before Advent and Christmas arrive. The servant church, the church of the broken metaphor of a king, is the church of little Mary's boy. This is the boy who becomes the suffering servant, who gives up his life for others, who heals the sick, who feeds the hungry, who liberates those who are oppressed. My theological mentor, the German wartime theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, famously said that the church is only the church when it exists for others. If we take that as the metric by which we are to be the church, if it is to establish our vision and our actions ahead, then we are going to be something quite different than the royal church. We start food banks. We build places for homeless veterans. We find safe places for LGBTQ+ youth. We reach out to our brothers and our sisters in the global community. Did you notice in that text, Jesus walked around every one of Pilate's questions about kingship? Because I think he wasn't going to accept that definition or be defined by that image of kingship, which Pilate knew, which Pilate understood. The kingdom of this king is not of this world. This king proves to be weak and crucified and crowned with thorns. Not your monarch of the first century and not your monarch of the 21st. I keep thinking of a congregation I heard of in Chicago who were dying, and they knew they were dying. And they saw that hundreds of school kids went by their front door every day. So they decided, and they did the unthinkable, they decided if we're going to die, which we are, let's serve the people around us until it's over. So they spent all their financial reserves on helping the neighborhood youth. And when it came time to sell their building, they gave the money to continue to help those youth. And they sold the cathedral in order to become a servant church. So Jesus says to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." And Pilate probably stood there thinking, "And you're not like any king that I've ever met." That's the Jesus we follow. Thanks be to God. Amen.